Hello, and welcome to another episode of Partner Buzz, the AWS Partner Focus podcast for our business and technical leaders from our APN community. Previously, we covered how AWS Partners can leverage best practices from the AWS well-architected framework to build sustainable cloud workloads. Now today, instead of focusing on sustainability in the cloud, we're diving deeper into how partners can leverage their existing skills and expertise to drive sustainability outcomes through the cloud. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Elliot Richards from the hugely popular Fully Charged show to give us a glimpse of what we can expect based on his observations across APAC. Elliot, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
It's fantastic to have you. To set us up, tell us a little bit more about your role on the Fully Charged show and also Everything Electric.
Yeah, so I've been with a YouTube channel called The Fully Charged Show for about 4 years now.
And we'll have a link in the description because I think it's a great channel.
Perfect, good plug. And we've been covering renewable technology, a lot of EVs, everything in that kind of space for the last about 12 years. And from about 2020, we started covering tech, renewable energy, and EVs from China. And that's kind of where my focus has been. And we've just come to Sydney for the Everything Electric show at the Sydney Olympic Showground, where we had 3 days of amazing technology, heat pumps, solar panels, tiny homes, and lots of EVs. Nice.
And I think one of the key points to note is EVs, obviously cool cars, but there's a lot that has to be in place within an economy, within manufacturing sector to actually get to a point where we actually have electric cars. Unpack a bit of that for us.
Yeah, so I mean, EVs are, I think we said the sharp edge of the knife, and I think in order to get electric cars, you need to build the infrastructure around it. And, that's where China in particular has been very focused over the past 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. And
they've built up that infrastructure around electric cars, but it also has many other benefits in other areas, moving China towards, its green transition.
I think the infrastructure is interesting because I think folks probably don't necessarily understand. Yes, we're talking about obvious things like charging infrastructure, but it's a whole different supply chain, operational model, manufacturing capability as well, which has to be in place before you actually get that finished product. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, it's from the, where the minerals are mined, how they're shipped across. It's everything until the, finished product. And China had a policy called the Made in China 2025 policy, which came out in 2015, which really accelerated this transition to renewables and just changing basically the whole economy to pivot around being more sustainable, being more renewable. And so that affects the whole supply chain. And obviously what China does affects the whole world.
Indeed. And I think it's particularly noteworthy for our listeners outside of China, because ultimately, as we have more things like mandatory ESG reporting, which we're going to cover later in the show, these are things which you have first-hand experience of over the past few years in China. I think it's really going to be great to dig into your perspective of what that could look like as we go forward, especially here in Australia, for example. One of the great videos, I think, which you explained in the show is how the city of Shenzhen drove a complete transformation almost overnight from a diesel-powered fleet to fully electric. And we'll have a link in the description for that video. But unpack a little bit of what that looked like.
Yeah, so we visited Shenzhen in about 2020, 2021. And we were very interested in to see how they did this. How can a city of, I think, 17 million people, so on a gigantic scale.
Which is remarkable. I mean, the population of Australia is 26 million, so that's a large city.
Yeah, and it's not even one of the biggest in China. It's, third or fourth. Yeah. And I think we just want to see, how can you transition that quickly?
Yeah.
How can you do that? How can you set up the infrastructure to, change all your cabs to electric? How can you change all your buses to electric?
Right.
What's the infrastructure look like? How do you plan that? How do you plant the cabling? How do you supply the power? All these questions, and it was really a remarkable achievement because it got all those government agencies to come together, to work together to basically this end date to say, right, on this date, we want fully electric fleet.
Working backwards from that, how do we actually do it? Because really, I think from what you've described, there's a huge number of challenges within those constraints. We're all familiar with the fact that, charging electric vehicles is very different from fossil fuel vehicle, but there's some similarities. You have to get energy from one place to the other, but it's a different operational model too, isn't it? For example, how we refuel an electric vehicle has opportunities as well. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely. And what we saw there was the charging at the bus station. So the bus stations need bigger chargers because
buses are bigger
batteries,
Makes sense.
And then there's multiple of them which need charging at the same time. But they told me they don't charge it during the day. And when we looked at the buses that were charging, it was only about 3 or 4 out of the many thousand that they have.
Wow.
And what they do is they obviously wait until nighttime when it's cheaper.
Right.
And then they plug it into the chargers and do most of their charging then.
Which is fascinating because I suppose that is a constraint, but now it's created opportunity as well because you can choose when you're charging based on, cost, availability, convenience. It's not just that, power or your fuel costs the same no matter when you do it, which is a great opportunity to think about how you can also think about optimizing a system going forwards as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what they're thinking of as the next step is, okay, so what can we do to make this even more affordable or even easier for us? So let's put solar panels on all of our bus charging stations.
Yeah, seems an obvious.
Yeah, and let's put a mega battery pack just off to the side of our bus station. Let's enjoy all of the free sunshine during the day, charge that battery, discharge it at night. So then it almost becomes off-grid buses. They've got their own grid system.
Which is kind of thinking about that radical decentralization. So instead of having centralized generation, you're pushing it very much close to the edge, which I suppose is an interesting analogy to cloud computing, where we see a huge amount of value pushing towards the edge, computation. This is a very familiar operational model that I think a lot of our AWS partners will understand. And I think also the user experience is significantly better too.
Yeah, so the user experience, so we spoke to a couple of bus drivers and taxi drivers, and all of them were full of praise because the buses are easier to drive, they don't smell. The ride is smoother for passengers.
Of course.
And they just said the whole experience is just so much easier. And then they said the charging experience for them was actually a delight.
Right.
Especially with the taxis. So instead of going to a fuel station, spending 5 minutes to fill up and then having to go back to work, they've got these big relaxation centers.
Right.
And there's many of these within Shenzhen, and in there you can go and get a massage. You can go and get a doctor's appointment.
Wow, okay.
With an online doctor. So you go into a little booth and speak to a doctor online.
Wow.
So, maybe, your legs hurt from driving too much, and they can give you a diagnosis and give you medicine. So all of these, benefits that they actually get from driving electric, rather than before, having to rush around, fill up with petrol and go back out again.
Interesting. So the user experience significantly better from those operating within the industry and those using it as customers, which I think is remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that model has now been replicated. So not just in Shenzhen, it's now in Shanghai, it's now in Beijing, it's now in Chongqing. So everyone's switching over to the electric model.
Interesting.
Just because it just makes so much more sense.
One of the key points that I think was a bit of a light bulb moment for me watching that video is when you were inside the control center.
Yes.
That was just mind-boggling, the amount of data you had coming in. Walk us through that.
Yeah, that was a real delight for me. I stepped in that room. They said, this is our big data screen. I thought, okay, that's interesting. Oh, no, it's live data from all of our 16,000 buses
and 22,000 taxis,
yeah,
I think.
And
wow.
I couldn't believe it. So you saw all these dots on a map of Shenzhen. They were individual taxis, individual buses, and it gave us the state of charge of the bus, how many passengers were on the bus. There's so much data that you get from each individual vehicle, which means that on a bigger scale in headquarters, they can see, okay, this route maybe needs some more charging soon for these buses,
right? Or
there's too much load on this charging area.
So you can actually start to dynamically control how the network works in real time, as opposed to setting up a fixed timetable, months or years in advance.
Yeah, and then you can see where's the traffic jams at 8 o'clock in the morning. Should we change the route? Can we make this route more efficient? And it just gave you so much valuable data that they could really optimize and make their trips more efficient. And I think the most important one was it was tracking how many kilometers collectively they all did per day. And we got there about 10 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
And it said over 1 million kilometers.
Gosh, by 10 a.m.
By about 10 a.m.
Wow.
I thought that's
remarkable.
All that diesel or petrol is not going into the
built.
atmosphere. So that's staggering.
That's fantastic. I think the data piece is quite remarkable. Like, we're well aware that if you can monitor monitor plant or assets and think about predictive maintenance, that can ensure you've got less disruption. all that requires data. And I think what you've described is how the availability of data has improved not just the ability to drive this transformation, but also deliver the ability to actually manage that better long term in that instead of being reactive, you can actually get proactive. And I'd imagine that the opportunities around predictive maintenance purely from that data will reduce costs, reduce outages, and really just provide a much smoother experience at a low cost as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's all about efficiencies because, public transportation, they want it to be the most efficient public transportation, system in the world, the metro as well.
Yeah.
And that's what they can do with that data insights. And then that's something that can be replicated in other cities. They can learn from it and what they actually do is they have other governments coming in from overseas. I think they're talking to like a government from Chile, for example, who came in to learn from how this system works, how they can make it more efficient, therefore saving, companies money in the long run.
So potentially all the investment that they placed into building what is effectively a really fantastic city-scale pilot has really accelerated other cities to be able to deliver this as well, fundamentally because of that access to data and the ability to drive that efficiency through scale, through that sharing of learning.
Yeah, and the great thing is Shenzhen is the home of BYD. That's where most of the electric buses are made. So if you link up with them, you can, BYD can then share that data with, the Shenzhen Bus Company, I think they were called. And then that can be used in London, in Sydney. It benefits everyone in the end, all of this, data collecting.
Yeah. So really, I think it's interesting that the data has created value. And I think this is something which we talked with our AWS partners about a lot. If you can reduce costs through operational efficiencies, but to really start to double down and create value, we have to access and unlock data. And it sounds like that's exactly what they've done, which is fascinating.
Yeah. And, it's the data that they collect in China is obviously large because there's over 1.2 billion people. They're all using, public transport. And it's such a wide amount of data that is so valuable that they can, it's not just public transport. They can then share that with car companies or autonomous car driving companies or the traffic network. So, for example, as of the last 6 months, in your GPS in your car, it will link up now with the traffic lights.
Okay.
So the traffic light will say it's got about 30 seconds left. And that will show up on your car GPS now.
Fascinating.
And that has come in the last kind of 6 months. And they were trialing that about 2 years ago.
Interesting.
Using these 4G or 5G networks. And now, so it makes such a more efficient transportation system. So roads become less congested. Taxis can make their journeys quicker. They're more affordable. It's just about massive efficiency and saving time.
Which also then allows you to make more considered investments.
Yes.
Where if you understand exactly where those hot points are, put the investment where it's needed, it's significantly more efficient, saving time as well, I think, which is great. What I find is quite mind-boggling is the fact that this was a video that you made about 3 years ago.
Yes.
So instead of talking about the fact that the future is now, the future is actually 3 years ago.
Correct.
Which I think is even more food for thought. And what I love about this conversation is that you're able to paint a picture of what potentially we could expect as we move into the renewables transition that we have happening here in Australia, for example. So,
yeah, absolutely. I think, I don't want to say we're living in the future, but we are. And I think what's happening in China now will be replicated across other countries in the future because they have the scale to do things very quickly. They have the resources. So it
makes sense to learn from that experience as opposed to having to replicate from scratch.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is more efficient. That I think is amazing. I mean, that kind of picture of what drove that transition is something I'd love to dig into. Where did that understanding that the renewable future was something China had to lean into, where did that come from?
I mean, there was multiple points really, but I would say the biggest one was probably the visibility of the pollution. So, China from, the early 2000s up until, 2012 was, growing every year. GDP was, off the charts. And that's because they were producing so much in their factories.
Yeah.
The West has for a long time, shipped over its industries to China. So, people in London have very clean air. People in Sydney have, mostly clean air because industry has moved to China. But the result of that was massive pollution.
Interesting.
Which was horrific, and you saw it every day. Now, back when I arrived in China about 2008, you just thought it was fog.
Yeah.
We didn't actually know. And then we soon realized after, a few years, oh, actually, this is pollution. It's not good. But there was a pivotal moment, I think in about 2015, I think it was.
Right.
And a lady produced a documentary called Under the Dome. She'd just given birth to her child.
Right.
And she was worried about the pollution in the air. Will it affect her child's upbringing, her development? And so she produced this documentary sanctioned by the government, basically saying, we're living in this awful environment which has been created by all of these factories here. We need to do something about it. We need to clean this up, or forever we're going to be suffering from the effects of pollution. And that was really interesting because it was not against the government so much, but it was criticizing the lax environmental standards in the country. And that was really a pivot point where people started thinking and caring about the environment. We can't keep destroying the country that we're living in. We can't keep, chopping down trees or polluting, rivers. We have to actually think about this seriously. And then that, for me, was kind of the point where everything changed. People started thinking. It had something like 500 million views in 24 hours.
Wow.
And it had such a massive impact on the country. And I think from that point on, everything has been much more focused on making the environment better.
So we talk at Amazon about being very customer focused, customer obsessed. And I think I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into how that's actually transitioned to customer perspectives and expectations today around sustainability. I think when we were preparing for the show, you mentioned that it seems very normal, very BAU, but that clearly must have been a bit of a journey, I think, for folks. How did customer perceptions change? Because I think that's something which our partners need to be aware of as we will go through this transition here.
Yeah, so it was approached from multiple angles, really. I think, it started off with a large, the government, state-owned enterprises which said, okay, we need to do something about this. So they were the first ones which kind of set it in motion. Then we started seeing the growth of EVs. Now that was a huge turning point because you started seeing these cars on the road with green number plates. You thought, oh, what's that?
Okay, interesting.
And there's a lot of discussion, especially in the UK, oh, should we have this green strip on the number plate? Of course, because it raises awareness that these electric cars and that more and more people are driving them. And so you started seeing this growth, in China. It was mostly fleets at the beginning, government-owned cars. And then it started becoming much more obvious that things were changing. There were chargers popping up everywhere. Solar panels were going on roofs. People were, worried about the local river, and then the government started cleaning it up, and now people swim in it.
Wow,
and
which has been quite a remarkable change.
Absolutely. There's this river in Beijing, which when I was there back in 2008, you would not swim in. Back in the 1960s, everyone swam in it. But the pollution had been so bad. Now people are swimming back in it again in 2023, 2024. So I think it's these visible, clear changes that have taken place.
That have actually driven a cultural change almost as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is people are allowed to have obviously more than one child now. The government's actively encouraging it because of the declining birth rate. And people are much more worried about the health of their children in the future. That encompasses many different areas. So what the food they eat, where have these vegetables come from? Has it come from contaminated soil? I only want the best. And they don't want to keep importing it from other countries. They want to have good quality stuff for their own children. I think one of the biggest pivot points was the baby milk scandal, where they had tainted baby milk and some babies died because of it. And they were thinking, well, what are we doing to our children? Why are we doing this? Why are we poisoning our environment, poisoning our children? What can we do to change this? And it spread from the children to the grandparents, and everyone started being much more aware of what they were putting into their bodies, the environment around them.
Which I think is certainly echoes when you start thinking about understanding what is in your supply chain, being able to trace the provenance of goods, making sure that what you have, you actually answer where it came from. And I think that's something which a lot of our partners are looking at, thinking about how we can drive supply chain integration solutions around that as well, which I think is critically important for that mindset and that customer demand.
Absolutely. And the key is China's a very tech-focused nation. So everyone has their phones and they've got these super apps.
Yeah.
And the super apps will track, they buy everything on the super apps and they can track things now. So if you want to track where your vegetables have come from the farm,
wow,
you can now track that using either blockchain technology in the back end, or you can track down who the farmer is. You can see a message from the farmer. You can track exactly where it's gone. And now customers are now using this technology. They might not realize they're using it to track, where their food has come from. And I think that's really important.
Which is an expectation now.
Yes.
Because that level of supply chain transparency has gone right down to people doing their grocery shopping.
Exactly.
Which is fascinating. I think normally we think in terms of, here it's a corporate level concern, but I think from what you've described, it's actually gone all the way down through the supply chain right to the end user, the end consumer, which is fascinating. Something else which you spoke about is the ability to leverage technology to make all of this affordable and accessible. Here in Australia, electric vehicles are still largely an expensive prestige item. You mentioned that being able to invest in things like public transport, make it more affordable and accessible, means that suddenly sustainability isn't a choice for those who are more prosperous. It's far more accessible. Walk us through that and the impact that's had.
Yeah, so I think China's all about getting everyone out of poverty. They moved something like 800 million people out of poverty in the last 20 or 30 years. And so, about making it a more level playing field. It shouldn't just be for the rich people to own these, electric cars or electric vehicles. So the affordable option now, or the normal option, is electric anything.
Yeah.
So, for example, the scooters in Shanghai, you won't find any petrol gas scooters in Shanghai. Everyone has an electric scooter. It might have a lead acid battery, but it's the more affordable option.
Right.
It also means they can do battery swapping. It means they can track, where the next battery swapping station is for their electric bike. And this is for people who do, the deliveries.
Right.
Who might, deliver your vegetables or your groceries. And so it's really permeated throughout the whole society. And they've been able to keep, metro prices, for example. It's about 40 cents a ticket to go anywhere in Shanghai. You can go about 50 kilometers for about that price. And so, it's just the normal option, whereas using, fossil fuels is seen as the expensive option.
Right.
And so it's all about this, obviously, the price, and the added benefit is that the environment won't suffer so much.
I think it's really interesting because certainly we see rooftop solar, for example, being one of the largest size of photovoltaic generation in Australia. And I think we're all acutely aware of the cost of living pressures and how electricity prices are a major part of that. Thinking about the cost driver, being able to get that to price parity and below will be something which can only be unlocked through the application of technology. But I think also you mentioned public policy was critical there as well. And I think as we in Australia are moving towards our net zero target of 2050, things like a mandatory environmental sustainability governance reporting, ESG reporting, has been a very key part of that to move forward. We've got ESG legislation, which is going to be taking into effect this year. That's not a new thing in China, is it? That's a path that has been well trodden, I think. Unpack that for us. Yeah,
so they started ESG reporting back in 2012, and that was with the insurance and banking sectors first of all.
Which is interesting, because normally you'd think that would be large-scale manufacturing and emitters, but why the interest in banking and insurance?
I think because they already had the data sets in place. They have a wide number of customers. They have systems behind it already, whereas the manufacturing at that stage was not particularly high tech.
Interesting. So those sectors already had things like, reporting requirements for risk and compliance, which is fairly familiar to where a lot of our partners work in FSI, I would think.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So, China has a fair amount of bureaucracy, as you can imagine. So these companies are used to reporting, doing lots of reports, reporting back to the government.
So it's an incremental type of reporting almost.
Correct. So it's just an addition at that stage. It was, a step they needed to take. So they've had it in that sector since 2012. And then it moved into other sectors. Later on, I think it was in 2016, they moved it as part of that Made in China 2025 policy. They moved it into the other sectors as well. And then I think by about 2020, 2021, all state-owned enterprises, so that's the massive conglomerates, whether it be cars, rice, whatever it is, they have standardized reporting that they have to do.
Right.
So that it's now become very normal. very much part of
very
their everyday.
Just an additional type of ESG reporting we're normally doing, which is interesting because I think that's an example of normalizing that is going to be absolutely critical. I think in Australia we're looking at having, most businesses to a certain size will have to have, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reporting by 2030. And that'll be phased in from our larger emitters as part of our safeguard program all the way down to our smaller businesses. And thinking about how the data aggregation requirements are going to be quite remarkable in order to keep that cost of reporting down. I think you had a really good story about how an insurance company were able to leverage that data. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so there's a big insurance company in China, one of the largest, and they were able to, with technology, with data, really scale down that period of reporting. Whereas I think at the moment it takes some companies many, many months to report.
Yeah.
They managed to squeeze it down to just 22 days.
Gosh.
To do that reporting. So then it almost becomes a monthly thing or just part of the day-to-day. It's a very big change.
Which I think also means if you've got that level of frequency of reporting, you've almost got that near real-time visibility of emissions. So you can then, once you measure something, you can improve it. Anecdotally, some folks I've spoken to in the space talk about, spreadsheets, paper-based. It takes 11 months or so to collate that information manually, which is terrible because that means you can't actually drive that actionable insight that you need. And I think that's a really fantastic opportunity for our partners to leverage the expertise they've got around that data aggregation. I mean, thinking about what you described in Shenzhen, being able to get that real-time visibility requires a really sophisticated view of things like IoT, sensor aggregation, visualization, machine learning, putting that together to build forecasts, which certainly can help your reporting. But I think also if we can encourage our partners to think about how can they add value with that data. I think if you had to aggregate that data to begin with, you've made that investment for reporting purposes. Now, how can you unlock the value in that data to now create value instead? I think that's going to be really quite fascinating.
Yeah, it will. If you do that shorter reporting time, it will become a fundamental part of your business, and it will drive efficiencies. It will, like you said, add value to your company. It's not just a tick box exercise, which I think it might feel like sometimes at the moment. It can actually make real fundamental changes to your business, and I think that's what's important.
And that value creation is interesting because you spoke to me about how it's dramatically reducing time to value, which blew my mind. Talk us through that story.
Yeah, so typically I was speaking to a CEO of a Chinese electric car company, and they say typically a German company, for example, would take about 3 years to develop a car.
Right.
And they got to go test, you got to learn, and it takes a long time. Lots of engineers, probably lots of meetings. They said in China, he said he wanted a sedan. And he wanted it very quickly. So from him saying that to his team, to the car being on the market, took 8 months. Which
you can only really do if you've got that maturity in data modeling, the ability to actually drive operationally efficient supply chains. So again, it kind of comes all the way back to all the bits and pieces you've got to have in place beforehand, which has now dramatically reduced that time to value, which is great. So they've got all of the ingredients. They've got all of that data from their many millions of cars they've sold for the past, 20 years or so. Yeah. And now they can really supercharge, their development process. So, testing, the wind tunnel testing can be done via computers. It can be done virtually. It can be done very quickly on, these huge computers. And then, testing designs, and they know what motors are the most efficient. They know what batteries are the most efficient. They know the software they need to use for the typical user in China across 99% of its journeys. So, it can really tailor this car to that market. And chances are that car will sell much better than the legacy car brand, which after that 3 years is already 3 years behind this Chinese car. So it's that immediacy of data, and much the same as I think a lot of our partners that work around generating, say, customer 360. This should sound very familiar to them because ultimately this is what they do already in a slightly different sphere. But now thinking about how that value can be unlocked to create from that vast pool of data that you need for that ESG reporting, which is critically important in its own right. But now it doesn't necessarily have to be something that costs you money. It actually creates and unlocks value too. I think if we can empower folks to think about what that could look like, that's going to become hugely valuable to customers because they can then see the tangible benefits. And one of the things I think you've spoken about a lot is that these are IT companies. So they will actually need folks who've got that deep expertise in cloud, in IT, to actually unlock that to make it work?
Yeah, they're not specifically IT companies. They're manufacturing companies who are pivoting much more towards software.
Yeah,
because they know software is the key to unlocking.
But that's not their core business necessarily.
No.
Yeah.
But they know that's so important to driving those efficiencies and creating value.
We often talk about partners positioning themselves as trusted advisors for customers. And I think this is going to be a challenge which, through the learnings, for example, that you've shared with us, will be a fantastic way to help our partners be that trusted advisor, to help those customers look around corners at what they're going to be seeing next. I think really, when you think about what's already happening today, I think you mentioned blockchain being a great enabler for doing supply chain management. There's data that unlocks value. And I think you had a few industrial applications you mentioned, I think. Drones as well in agriculture, which is, everyone loves drones. Take us through that story.
Yeah, so obviously the big drone manufacturer in China who produces most of the drones used around the world. And they make commercial drones, and what they're doing is helping agriculture in China. Now, agriculture up until a few years ago was quite basic. It's poorer people in the countryside with, only very basic technology. But what they've been able to do is send these drones in for a few days. It doesn't cost very much. They've trained something like 40,000 drone pilots.
Wow.
And there's something like 120,000 agricultural drones now in China.
Gosh.
And they can create rice which is 20% more efficient, gives them 20% more yield, for example. And so that farmer then can make 20% more money, and then they can invest in maybe some better technology for themselves or just improve their lives. And so technology has really uplifted everyone in the whole country, whether they're a rural farmer in the middle of nowhere or someone who lives in the city. Everyone benefits from this data that is being aggregated in the cloud.
I think that makes a huge amount of sense, because ultimately, again, it all comes back down to data, doesn't it? Typically, the sustainability journey that I think we see at AWS is that it all starts off with that ability to understand where you need to be. And that could have a number of business drivers, but fundamentally there's that strategy that needs to be put in place and that advisory piece. But then it comes down to, complying with things like ESG reporting. And I think this is something that our partners, especially in the FSI space, are well aware of how to handle. And I think you hit the nail on the head, where it's just an incremental concern. But it's going to become a little bit more wider reaching than that, because there'll be different sources of data to be integrated. But then once you've got that data and you're doing that reporting, unlocking value, think about optimization is critical. And then moving on to that transition through these like individual industry vertical plays, which I think are fantastic. And I think if that's the mental model, we have partners who already have got great capability in these spaces, who I think are set up for success to drive this. We've got partners who've got great sustainability advisory practices, reporting and compliance. That's something which we've got great capability with. And then there's partners who go super deep in industry. We often talk about that strong industry focus here at AWS. I think you've really nailed why that's important, because if you're not an IT customer, but you understand that software and computing is something to actually drive that outcome, you need a trusted partner who can help you get there, who can help you look around those corners. And I think without this sort of insight, it's very difficult. Our partners will largely be reactive. So this has been fantastic. I really appreciate the insights you've shared with us, Elliot, today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been delightful to be here.
That's all we've got time for today. But I hope it's given our audience some really good insights on how we can work better together to serve our AWS customers. Thank you for spending the time with us today, Elliot.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And from me, thank you for listening to this episode of Partner Buzz. Please make sure that you subscribe to the show so that you never miss an episode. And we look forward to you joining us next time. But Elliot, I think the last word should be yours.
Okay. I'm Elliot Richards. This has been the AWS Partner Buzz podcast. And thank you for watching.
Thank you.